Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hello. Just before this starts, I'll put a post in the chat as well. I just want to let you know that we will be posting this recording public on YouTube. So if you do not wish to speak and rather just post in the chat, or you're happy for people to hear your voice on YouTube, what have you, then please proceed. If you don't want it being put onto YouTube and made public, please drop me a message to the NHS-R inbox. Thank you.
All right, shall I get started? Hi, everybody. My name's Toby. My pronouns are he, him. I'm Director of Curriculum with the Carpentries. Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk to you today about code review. And that reminds me that I should probably share my screen. Let's have a look and see if I can find the right one. Okay. Zoom tells me that my screen is being shared, but if you can't see anything, then please speak up and let me know. So I want to talk today about better, kinder code review. There's going to be sort of a combination of styles here. I've got some slides prepared that I'm going to be relying on to help me tell you a bit about the kind of theory, I suppose, behind this. If not, theory isn't quite right. Some of the principles, at least, I think that I want to try to communicate to you. And then I've got a example repository prepared on GitHub that I'll use to demonstrate some of the things that I've been talking about. To hopefully make it a little bit clearer how I recommend that you do things. All right. So before I get to that, though, I want to tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for, the Carpentries. So we describe ourselves as a community-led organization teaching essential software and data skills to enable open, reproducible research. And that's true. We are an organization. I am employed by the organization. It's an independent nonprofit registered in the USA. But really, when I think about the Carpentries and when I talk about the things that the Carpentries does, this word community here is much more important, I think. There's these two overlapping concepts involved, the organization and the community. So the organization is effectively like this core team of people, one of whom is me, who is employed to facilitate and support the activities of the community more broadly. But then the community itself is much, much, much larger than that. There's 9 of us in the core team. There's thousands of people in this community all over the world. And what those people are doing in the community is various different activities to help build capacity in software and data skills for research, and in particular looking at open practices, open source languages like R, and things like that. We're really a very values-driven organization and community, and we strive through those values to be inclusive as a community, to be open as a community, to use open practices, and also to be open in terms of how we are operating, open to receiving feedback and so on, which brings me to the last point, that we also strive to always be learning. And so I gather, for example, that you're going to be getting a link to a feedback survey at the end of this session. And if you do receive that link to give feedback on this session, I really urge you to fill that in, because I'm really keen to get feedback on this session so that I can improve it for next time. The Carpentries exists as a sort of umbrella for these, what we currently have as 3 lesson programs. We have data carpentry, library carpentry, and software carpentry, and the community is teaching workshops within each of these lesson programs. So a data carpentry workshop focuses on good practices in data organization, data handling, data management, again with a kind of focus on research environments. And so We have various domain-specific curricula that are taught in workshops to teach these good practices to people working in ecology, working in social sciences, working in genomics, and so on. Library carpentry is focused more on people in sort of library roles and information-related roles, looking at good practices and skills that you can pick up to help work with and manage large amounts of information. And software carpentry looks more at sort of software engineering principles, I suppose, but in a relatively short time frame. What that ends up being is looking at, instead of best practices for software development, what we like to call good enough practices, how we can help researchers who have to write code for their research to do that in a way that's more sustainable, more reproducible, less likely to go wrong, and so on. And all of the lessons that are taught in these workshops are available online for free. They're licensed under the CC BY license, Creative Commons Attribution. So that means that anybody can take them and adapt them and reuse them, provided that they acknowledge the original source of the materials. And we love to see it when people do that, and they do it all the time. The way that those workshops operate and the way that the carpentries operates is broadly kind of summarized in this figure. The idea is that we have learners joining these workshops and picking up these skills and good practices that we want to teach them in those workshops. And those workshops are delivered by what we call instructors. A carpentries instructor is a person who's attended our instructor training, which is a 2-day-long training course, followed by some relatively short, what we refer to as checkout activities to complete the certification. And then once people have done those tasks, they receive this instructor certification that enables them to teach these official carpentries workshops. That instructor training, I just want to take a moment to talk about. It looks at findings in educational psychology, what the research, what the evidence shows about how people learn and what the most effective ways are to teach them. And it helps people understand this sort of approach to teaching based around live participatory demonstration, live coding, getting people to code along with you as you're writing code, and things like that. That really is the cornerstone of all of our workshops. I am aware that I will sound biased because I work for the organization, but I volunteered with the carpentries for about 5 years before I joined the core team. And during those 5 years as an instructor, I gained so much more ability and confidence with teaching, and developed my kind of professional network to a huge extent as well. All of this really coming about because I joined that instructor training. And if you need to teach things to people in a formal capacity or even in an informal capacity, I really strongly recommend this instructor training course. It really fundamentally changed the approach that I take to teaching, and I know that I'm not alone in that. So yeah, do check it out if you can. I've got some links at the end of the presentation that will point you towards where you can learn more about that online. So thanks for listening to the little bit of background about where I'm coming from, I suppose, some context. But now let's move on to talk about the main topic of the session, which is where I'm going to try to encourage you and show you how to do better and kinder code review. And we'll talk about why as well. So I'm going to examine good code review practices from a couple of different angles. There's going to be the practicalities. So how can you review code effectively? We'll look at how you can use some of the features in GitHub to do that. But we'll also talk a little bit about what I might refer to here as the philosophy of code review. So how can you do that kindly? Why is it important to do it kindly? How can you provide targeted, constructive feedback that will help improve the code, but also help improve kind of collaboration within your project team as well? And along the way, we're going to discuss why both of those aspects are important, how they relate to each other, and how they can feed off each other, so that doing things practically more effectively can help you also do things more kindly, and vice versa. At any point, if you've got questions throughout this, then feel free to post into the chat. I'm trying to keep an eye on it as well, but if I miss something, then yeah, please interrupt me and let me know. So let's talk a little bit about why reviewing code is important. Since you signed up to come to this session, I assume that you already agree to a certain extent that it is important, but let's talk about that anyway. A few of the reasons that I came up with are that reviewing code and talking about how it could be improved is a good way to help ensure that new code that's introduced into your project is consistent with what's already there and is of a good enough quality that it belongs in that code base for your project. It also helps to ensure that if you've got multiple people working on the same project, they're kind of kept in the loop about how the code base of that project is changing over time. And by getting people to do regular reviews, they're much more in touch with the evolution of the code as it's taking place. And perhaps I think most importantly, reviewing code and having your code reviewed can be an extremely valuable learning experience. So for the person who's writing the code, it can be really educational to get this feedback and pointers from somebody else in the team who knows more or knows different things about the topic and about the programming language. And reading the way that somebody else writes their code as a reviewer can be a really educational experience as well, to help you learn and think differently about the code that you're writing. Quick aside before I keep going, because I want to touch upon what feels like the hot topic at the moment. Feels like the entire world is constantly asking this question about pretty much anything that comes up. What about generative AI? And so it is clear that more and more developers out there are using tools like large language models, other kinds of AI to support their code development. And in the context of large language models for generating code, you might start to wonder whether collaborating with other people on code is going to be necessary much longer. With the rise of what people are referring to as vibe coding, where you give instructions to the LLM and work with the code that it gives you back without ever really taking a look at the individual lines of the program that it's writing. Are code review skills really necessary? So I'm going to, as you might expect, argue that they are. And indeed, with the rise of generative AI for coding, I think good reviewing skills are even more important now than they were before. Perhaps it's not as important that you are kind in your reviews of code that a large language model has produced as it is if you're reviewing code that a human has produced. But in terms of the ability to study code that something else has produced for you to meet a particular brief, it's totally essential for you to be able to do that well. Really, I think that at this point, along with good debugging skills to fix things when they go wrong, I think that at this stage, the primary role really of a developer who's using generative AI is in this kind of reviewing role. So providing directions to the tool about what to develop and then reviewing what it gives you back and thinking about how it could be improved, whether it's even doing the thing that you asked for and so on. And then, right now, agents are becoming more and more prevalent. So these tools that not only you can ask it to generate something for you, but it's able to go and test whether the code that it's written works, and if it doesn't, then to troubleshoot that and try to fix it. And in that context, even those kind of debugging skills are beginning to look less important than the reviewing skills. Ultimately, though, this is a really important point, I think, we as the people that direct those tools are always going to be ultimately responsible for any code that they produce. So we want to make absolutely sure that we're prepared to read through and review those lines of code that it produces, because it's on us, really, if we introduce that code into our code base and it introduces a security flaw or something terrible goes wrong and you lose a load of data or whatever else. And so on that point, I wonder if we're going to start to see people using generative AI to review code as well. If they do, it's going to be interesting to see how well these AI tools perform in relation to some of the recommendations that I'm going to share here today. But on a personal note, at least, I think that's pretty risky, even bordering on negligent, to outsource this kind of reviewing task to a AI model, because of that thing that I said before, that ultimately a human needs to be responsible for what code goes out there and gets run and works with data and so on. And I would really certainly much prefer to take a look at those changes myself than trust a piece of software to be able to do that for me and not to miss something. Okay, so back to code review then, and let's assume for now that we're going to keep collaborating with other humans. What are some of the challenges associated with code review? Why is a presentation like the one that I'm giving now necessary in the first place? So first of all, I think it's important to accept that code review takes time, especially it takes time to do well. Some of the practices that I'll discuss here today should help with that a bit. And generally, I think one of the things that's important to stress is that the more frequently you do code review, the more practice you get with it, then the quicker you're going to get at doing it. But there's no escaping the fact that it can be a time-consuming process. People also tend to find reviewing code or submitting their code for review intimidating. So the authors don't look forward necessarily to receiving feedback from their peers, from their colleagues, and they worry about having made some embarrassing mistake that's going to be exposed in the process of review. Reviewers sometimes worry about it as well, and about providing that feedback in a way that's helpful and isn't going to upset somebody. They worry about missing something important that they should have caught, or they worry about having to push back against colleagues' ideas and what kind of reaction they'll get in response to that, with fears of conflict and so on. And finally, reviewers can often feel a bit unclear about exactly what it is that they're supposed to review. I'm not going to talk about that part so much today, but if you look online, there are a lot of really good code review checklists out there, and I recommend taking a look at some of those if you want to find one that you and your team can agree upon and use that as a basis, as a foundation for your code reviews. I think that's a good idea. And now let's talk a little bit about some assumptions that I'm going to make in the rest of this discussion. There are certain things that you could include in a review of somebody's code that a human does, but that I strongly recommend that you outsource effectively to either some automated process or some documentation that you can refer to resolve potential discussions and disagreements and things like that. So things like formatting code, for example, can be automatically enforced in R with tools like this one, Air, which applies formatting rules to your code whenever you save the source file. If you write tests and automate them with continuous integration, then human reviewers don't need to spend any time checking that the code that people submit actually runs as part of the review. And when it comes to elements, not exactly of formatting, but of kind of style and organization of code, then what I recommend that you do as a group is agree upon a style guide that you're going to follow for your project. So that will describe some conventions that you all agree upon. And then if you come up against something in a review that's about style rather than function, you can refer to that style guide. You can defer to that style guide to make decisions. And if you find that there's something that isn't covered in that style guide, discuss it amongst the group and then add it in, so that next time you have that discussion, you can refer to the rules in the style guide. And with those things out of the way, we can start to talk about how to review code that's written by a human. So a tip of that to a guy called Mike Lynch, who wrote a pair of blog posts titled How to Do Code Reviews Like a Human, that are kind of borrowing, adapting from for the title of this section. And you're going to see a link to one of his posts in an upcoming slide. I'll share the links to these resources after the session so that you can check them out for yourself. The first thing to acknowledge then, when we're thinking about reviewing code that's been developed by another person, is that feedback is hard. It's hard to receive and it's hard to give a lot of the time. I mentioned before that folks can feel intimidated by the prospect of having their code reviewed, and this webcomic from Def Bulge goes some way to explaining why. We use this as a illustration in that instructor training that I mentioned earlier as well. I think it really nicely illustrates this, certainly my experience at least, of getting feedback on my teaching and public speaking. I try to work on this, but I think it's natural that even when the feedback that you receive on something is, really predominantly positive, even one clumsily worded or thoughtless negative comment can be what ends up staying with you. And another webcomic that we use in instructor training, this one from Luna Baboon, nicely summarizes how to ensure that when you are giving feedback to somebody, it's helpful feedback. This applies to code reviews as much as it applies to any other kind of feedback that you can give somebody. The point really is the good feedback, helpful feedback is positive, it's specific, and it includes recommended or at least a suggested next step. We're going to come back to all of these points repeatedly in the next, well, we've got an hour and 5 minutes still to go. There's enough slides for now, I think. Let's take some time to look at some of the practicalities of reviewing code. And I'm going to do that using the GitHub web interface. So I'll switch over to the other tab that I've got here. And I need to start with a couple of confessions, I think. First of all, I've arrived at this NHS-R event to talk to you all with an example repository that's written with Python. I'm sorry for that. I'm a Python user much more than I am an R user. And so it was considerably easier for me to create an example that would make sense in this context using Python. Since we're talking about code review rather than the kind of specifics of the syntax and so on, I think I'm pretty certain you're going to be able to follow along, and exactly what's going on each line of code isn't going to matter very much. But yeah, if there's any parts of this that are less clear for you than they would have been if I was using R source code, then yeah, I'm sorry about that. The other confession, I suppose, to make, although I don't know if confession is exactly right, I should acknowledge that I worked with the Claude Sonnet LLM to develop some of the example code here. This is part of a kind of ongoing process for me to try to scope out exactly how well these generative AI tools can be used for these kinds of tasks. I was surprised, I guess, to discover how well it worked in this case. So that was an interesting learning experience for me as I was going through this. So anyway, what we've got here then is an example project. It's a at the moment, very simple Python package that, as it says here in the README, generates results from as if you're rolling a dice. So it's effectively a random number generator. At the moment, it's extremely simple. We've got our main.py file here, which contains all of the functionality of the package. So this function roll die here takes an argument, a number of sides that would be on the die that's rolled, and then generates a random integer between 1 and the number of sides that's there, and returns that number. And so what we get is when we install this, is a command line tool where we can ask this executable to roll a die, so to speak, and give us back the number that's the result. Just a single die for the time being instead of multiple dice, yeah, we are stuck with that for the time being. There's no tests for this. There's no documentation really, apart from the things that are in the doc strings at the beginning of the function definitions. Yeah, so very, very sparse for the time being in this project. We've also got a number of open issues and pull requests. We'll look at the pull requests in a moment, and indeed we'll spend most of our time looking at those, I suppose. But let's take a look at the issues that are here for now. So from the titles and the labels on them, we can get an idea of what we've got. We've got some suggestions. We should add some tests to make sure that the code is doing what we want it to. We can improve the documentation, at least to some extent, by adding some more information to the README. We could, let me drop this into the chat, so in case anyone's been trying to type the URL in. There we go, if anyone wants to take a look. We've got a couple of, we've got a feature request here to expand the program to allow you to roll multiple dice at once. We've got a suggestion to switch from using print statements to give back the results to sending the information to the standard error and standard output streams instead, and to add a verbose mode to switch the logging information sent to standard error on and off. And we've got an issue to validate the input as well. So at the moment, there's no validation going on. The program assumes that someone's providing an integer value as the argument to the executable. And if someone provides something else, then there's no kind of checks there to give feedback to the user that they've been doing things wrong. And what you can see down the right-hand side here is that each of these issues has been assigned to somebody. This is a alter ego account that I have on GitHub for these kinds of teaching purposes. And so what we'll see in a moment is that the pull requests that have been opened to address some of these issues have been opened by me in the guise of this Hodges account instead of my usual Toby Hodges account. And so let's take a look at those pull requests. We've got 3 open at the moment. One that expands the README, one that uses standard error and standard output streams for the information that the program gives back to the user, and one that adds that larger feature to allow the program to run to roll multiple dice at once. To demonstrate how you can use the features of GitHub effectively for code review, we're going to take a look at this expand README pull request. Sorry, just a moment, I need to drink some water. All right. And so when we open a pull request, we get, when we open the page of a pull request, I should say, in GitHub, we get to look at the title, which tells us that we're expanding the README, and then we get to see the description if the contributor has added it, that kind of summarizes the changes and the motivation for making those changes. So we can see here that this user is saying, this contributor is saying that this pull request fixes issue number 2 by expanding the README to include installation instructions, examples of usage, and some contact information. And you might have noticed when I was hovering my cursor over the word fixes, a little pop-up appears that says this pull request closes issue number 2. So what that tells us is that when this pull request gets merged, GitHub will automatically take care of going and closing that issue number 2, because it should have been fixed by the changes that are introduced with this pull request. And we can see as well here the branch of the pull request includes these 3 new commits, adding install instructions, adding usage examples, and adding contact information. But really, to do this gives us already some picture, I suppose. We can start to imagine what we would expect to see in the changes themselves in the pull request. But really, to do an effective review, we need to switch over to look at the changes themselves instead of relying on the description that the contributors provided. So let's click on the Files Change tab in that pull request interface. And here you can see then that this line has been removed from the readme.md and has been replaced by these new 16 lines. So we've got still the description, a simple command line dice rolling utility. Then we've got headings for installation, usage, and contact. And this does contain the information that the person suggested that it was going to, but there's a few things missing that I think we can add to make this better. And so we can start doing our review. You'll have already seen, hopefully, at the top right here, you've got this review changes button, and I can click on that and get this pop up. It gives me the options to comment, to approve, or to request changes, and I can write some things in here as well. But before we get to that, we should use that as a kind of summary of our review overall. Let's look at how we can use these the functionality of GitHub to give specific targeted feedback. So you might have noticed as I was moving my cursor up and down in this, what we refer to as the diff view of the pull request, that there's this little blue button that's moving with my cursor to the left-hand side of each line. And what this allows us to do, if we click on that button, is add a comment that is kind of connected to that particular line that we were hovering our cursor over. And so we could add something in here, for example, that says it would be good to, or you could say better, to present these commands as formatted code blocks, let's say. This would be a sort of general comment about the line, but we can go one step further than that. If we add some empty lines here to make some space, we can click on this button here that has a plus and a minus inside a little document symbol. And it says here, add a suggestion. And if I click on that, then automatically populated into this comment box are these backticks with the word suggestion afterwards, and then the contents of the line that I'm commenting on, and then some more backticks to close that suggestion box. And what we're able to do then here is add in our suggested changes. So I would say backtick, 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 bash, backtick, backtick, backtick underneath to put this line as a formatted code block. Now, I just need to check something because I suspect that the combination of these backticks to start a suggestion and these backticks to start a formatted code block within the suggestion are going to confuse the markdown parser. So let's click preview. Yeah, sure enough, we're getting some weirdness there. So I'm going to add another backtick before suggestion and another backtick to the closing of that suggestion. And then let's take a look. So now we get the suggested change looking correct and the comment underneath looking correct. And so we can then either choose to add this as a single comment to our pull request, or we can click Start a Review. And if we choose Start a Review, as we're going to do, then what that does is it kind of queues up each of our comments that we are adding, and those comments will only become visible to the contributor who opened the pull request once we've finished the review and chosen whether we want to approve or request changes or whatever else. Let's click Start a Review. you'll see here now pending. So we're suggesting a change to replace this line with these 3 lines here. And there's a comment underneath. And so then we can do the same down here with these 2 usage lines, which also don't have those backticks around them. But in this case, let's suggest the changes to those both in a single comment. So instead of hovering over one particular line and choosing to click the button here, we will hold the mouse button down and drag downwards to select all 3 of these lines. And then when I let go, we now are commenting on lines +11 to +13, so all 3 of these lines. And when I hit the add a suggestion button here, we get that suggestion box with automatically populated with the contents of all 3 lines instead of only one. I'm going to add another backtick there and there to avoid the problems that we were having before. Put our backticks and put bash in. Let's leave an empty line between the 2 of them. Hit preview to make sure it looks okay. Yeah, we're replacing these 3 lines with these 7 lines, and click add review comment. And so by well, let's finish up. So then I also have one more comment that I want to make on this last line, the contact, which is that it would be more helpful to provide an email address so that someone can send an email. So here we want to change the words Toby Hodges to be a link to an email address. Let's use this one, tobyhodges@carpentries.org. Hit preview again to make sure that that looks okay. It does. And so then we can do add review comment there as well. And now we've got our 3 comments pending. And this is one of the things that I really want to encourage you to use wherever possible, as well as providing kind of written feedback, as I've done here to explain the change that I'm suggesting. Use this suggest changes feature as much as you can, because it can be kind of a painful process to try to articulate what you mean to somebody when you're reviewing their code. To try to explain exactly the changes that you would suggest that they make. When you use this suggest changes feature of GitHub, you can show them exactly what you mean. They can read exactly what you mean and understand that, and they can choose whether or not to accept that suggestion. If they do accept the changes that you suggest, both of you receive credit for those changes. So the person who was the author of the pull request originally receive some credit for this suggested change, but also the reviewer who suggested the change. Both of you get listed as co-authors on that commit when the change gets committed to the branch. And so this can be a nice way to encourage this sense of shared ownership of the code, which we're going to talk about again in a few minutes. But the biggest reason why I recommend that you use this feature is because it saves you a huge amount of time. I've been using GitHub for 12 years or something now, and I do remember the days before this feature existed, how painful it could be, how much more back and forth you could have in pull requests and trying to explain exactly how you wanted or that you recommended that code should be changed. Let's finish our review. So I can click on the green finish your review button at the top right, and I can choose to either comment, which is neither here nor there, I suppose, to approve the pull request. This is what we would do, or I recommend that you use this to indicate that you are happy for the changes to be merged into the project, or you can choose request changes, which is what we're going to do in this case, to indicate to the author of the pull request that you want them to change some things before you'd be happy to merge the changes into the project. So we've hit request changes, and then you can optionally leave a comment. I pretty much recommend that you always do leave a comment here. This should be a kind of conclusion, a summary, an overall sort of commentary on the review as a whole. The reason that I recommend that you pretty much always do include a comment here is because even if you have nothing else to say, it is always a good idea to thank the person who contributed this pull request for taking the time to do so. So thanks for submitting these improvements, and then I'll tag them. This is exactly what we need, but I would like to make a few adjustments before it gets merged in. So there, to try to embody that advice that was summarized in that webcomic earlier, I'm trying to be positive, thanking them, mentioning that this is exactly the kinds of changes that we were looking for, but then also providing this this kind of concrete next step. I'm saying that these changes need to be made before this thing can be merged. And then I'm being specific, not necessarily in this comment, but by using the suggested changes on the particular lines where I want the changes to be made. I'm being specific about exactly what should be changed. And so what my goal is here is really, in this case, it should be, I hope, straightforward for the contributor to come back to this pull request once they get notified, look through those suggested changes, commit all of them as changes to their branch, and then re-request review. I get to come back, check that they made the changes that I suggested that they did, and then when they have done that, I can click review again, this time choose approve, thank them one more time, and then once the pull request has been approved, it can be merged in. So let's do submit review. And you see then what appears is my overall kind of comment. I would like to make a few adjustments before it gets merged in. That's the first thing probably that the contributor will read, and then they can scroll down and see the specific changes that I'm suggesting that they make. And what they'll be able to do, if they look at this in the files changed view, as I was doing before, is they can then choose to add each of these suggested changes to a batch, like this, like this, like this. And then once they've done that with all of them, they can click this commit suggestions button, add in a commit message, or keep the one that is suggested by GitHub, which is what I think we can do in this case. And then they would commit those changes to adjust the file according to the changes that we asked them to do. And then they'd come back to the conversation. They can click this re-request review button, which then indicates to me as the person who reviewed it that the author thinks it's ready to be looked at again. I would come back, go to the files change tab again, make sure that things look as I wanted them to, which they do. Click review changes, approve this time. Thanks for the quick response. This looks great. Submit review, and then merge. Well, okay, I've got some protection rule that I must have messed up on the project, but we don't need to worry about that for now. If this wasn't grayed out, I would click on it and merge the changes in. So what questions do you have for me about that example and about this kind of functionality that GitHub provides to help you do specific constructive code reviews? I'll pause for a moment and take a drink and see what you want to ask. Sorry, go ahead. You're muted at the moment. I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I've not talked for a long time, so I forgot how to unmute myself. it wasn't about what you've shown us. It was more about the communications that come from GitHub, because you can get notified, can't you, when you're mentioned or if there's issues, a little bit like social media, I guess. And so what I was wondering was, what kind of notifications do people need to have set up? If they do, if you're doing a review and then you kind of like pick up, so say somebody does a review like you've shown, and then you reply, do they get emailed, notified? Do they have to go to GitHub to get that notification? I don't really know what happens
Great
on the other
question.
side.
So it depends a little bit on a few settings that you can adjust in GitHub. So if I go back to the front page of this project on GitHub, there's this box up here, this button up here that says watch. And you can choose there to a certain extent what level of notification you want to receive on this project. So by default, really, you've got this participating and mentions option selected. That should be the case, I think, for everybody on any project. If they are specifically notified, like someone uses this @ and then their username, then they should receive a notification to tell them that they've been mentioned in that conversation. Or what participating means here is that because you are the person who opened an issue or opened a pull request or commented already in the past on that issue or pull request, then when there's new activity in that thread, in that discussion, you'll also receive notifications about that activity too. So what that should mean, unless the person who contributed that pull request has selected this ignore option here, is that because they opened the pull request, when I make that review and add those comments, they should receive a notification from GitHub that review's come in. And then because I've made the review, that also means that I am participating in that pull request because I've reviewed it already. So when they then respond and tell me that it's ready to be reviewed again, I should receive a notification again, unless I've selected this ignore option. But then in the settings on your account, which I'm not going to open because this is going to go on YouTube. But if you go into the settings on your account, then you can find a section there that's about notifications, where you can then choose whether you want to receive notifications by email or to your notifications page on GitHub. You can see here that I pretty much always have unread notifications. And you can choose which kinds of notifications get sent in which way, and things like that. And if you look at this notifications page, mine is going to be a screaming hellscape, and I'm sorry for that. But you'll see that there are various filters that you can use down the left-hand side, so that you can spot things that are really the things that you're most likely to be interested in at this point. I hope that answered your question, Zoe. And then there's a question from, or a comment from Francis in the chat as well. I do think that the comment and review tools in GitHub are generally very useful, but it can still be quite intimidating. Also, I sometimes worry about resolving conversations prematurely, but in general, I find colleagues would rather have the conversation closed unless there is genuinely an outstanding question or the proposed action has not been done without a reason being given. I think that's generally absolutely right, and I think that the intimidating aspect of it is right to a certain extent. I think in particular, depending on how much practice you've had with this idea of kind of working in the open, making these kinds of reviews that are then publicly visible to the whole internet. I mean, people, I think, if they stumble upon that thread there, are going to be alarmed potentially at my state of well-being, because I appear to have had an entire conversation collaborating on a project with a person that is also me. But hey, there we go. And yeah, it can be. I have made embarrassing mistakes in projects, in pull requests, in reviewing pull requests, that afterwards I wished I had not posted to the internet. But one of the great things about the carpentries community, one of the reasons why I love working with it as much as I do, is that we have this real culture of people making mistakes being expected, this kind of learning, this culture of learning where we always treat errors and mistakes as learning opportunities and ways to improve. And generally speaking, I can rely on the collaborators that I have in my projects being empathetic, being kind, and helping me out when things have gone wrong. So I encourage you to try to build that kind of culture within the projects that you're working on as well. Not all of that culture building can be achieved by reviewing code well, but it is at least one way that you can start moving towards that. And generally, more generally, as I'm going to come to in a moment, one of the other recommendations, or maybe I'm going to come to it now. Let's see. I switch back to my slides. Yeah, right. So one of the recommendations that I make is to set conventions. We'll talk about that in a moment. So these are some other kind of practical points and things that you can do outside of the pull requests themselves, or perhaps sometimes within the pull requests, that will facilitate kind of better code reviewing practices in your project overall. So one of the first things that you can do is, where very large sets of changes have been presented together in a single pull request, you can ask authors to split those up into multiple pull requests so that things are more manageable in terms of review. Generally speaking, one set of changes delivered in a pull request should be self-contained, should address one particular goal, and people should try as best as they can to avoid scope creep of those pull requests to also include a bunch of other things. Generally, I think it's okay to do things like typo fixes that you spot while you're making another set of changes in the same pull request, but there are some projects that will be pretty militant about this and will say that even the typo fix should be put into a separate pull request so that the changes that are within that single pull request are really only focused on one particular issue. Again, I'll come back to this in a moment. I recommend that as a group of collaborators on the project, you discuss that kind of thing between you, set the standards, the norms, the conventions for your particular project, and try to build up that project culture so that everyone understands. You document somewhere whether or not doing things like fixing a typo or a broken link or something is an okay thing to do in a pull request that is primarily about other things. If you write your issue descriptions better, then you will find that people tend to also submit better pull requests. So the more clear, the more detailed your description of what needs to be done in your task list, wherever that is, usually it's issues on the repository, the better those descriptions are, the more that kind of facilitates a good pull request, a pull request that is targeted towards the specific thing that needs to be changed. What you don't want is for your code review to turn into a discussion of the design, of the implementation, or of the real problem, the underlying problem in the code, because really that's something that should have happened in that issue or on your task list somewhere before the author started working on the pull request itself. Or perhaps, while they were working on it at least, but before you get to that kind of final review, what should be a final review stage anyway. And then, yeah, discuss with your team, with your colleagues, with your collaborators, conventions for your project. So as an example, it's a good idea to talk about how you want to use those comment, approve, and request changes options that GitHub provides for pull request reviews. To give an example, in a lot of the projects that I work on, we agree that we will use approve, even sometimes when we're suggesting changes, when we feel that those changes that we're suggesting are kind of optional. So you're happy enough with the changes that are already there, you'd be fine with it being merged in. And so then you choose approve, but you still suggest the changes as a kind of gentle, I don't mind whether you go do it this way or not. It's fine already as it is, but this could be even better kind of message that you're trying to send. And then it's up to the person that opened the pull request to go ahead and merge as it already is, or to accept the changes that you've suggested, or some of the changes that you've suggested in your review before they do that. And I only use request changes then when I clearly want to indicate to the pull request author that I would not be happy to see the changes merged in yet until those requests have been addressed. And we pretty much never use the comment option because it leaves too much ambiguity, really. The end result of your review should really be, are you happy for the thing to be merged in yet or not? If you are, then you can choose approve, and if you're not, then you should choose request changes. But that completely, there's no firm rule book that states that, right? And indeed, they leave that comment option there for a reason. So I'm sure other projects are using it a lot more than we are. The point that I'm trying to make more generally is that it's a good idea to have these conversations with your colleagues, with your collaborators, so that you can agree on these things. Okay, I've got a half hour left, so let's get talking a little bit about the philosophy. So what's the kind of frame of mind that you should approach this task with? What are some of the most important principles to follow to ensure that the code reviews that you give contribute to and build a kind of healthier project culture, environment, as well as a better code base of the project as well? So to get us started, here's some tips that we provide to lesson developers in the Carpentries community during our collaborative lesson development training that teaches people good practices in how to design and build lessons as open source projects. So first, good reviews have empathy. So you should be, while you're providing this feedback on the changes, also considering the feelings of the contributor, making sure that you identify those positives, that you thank them, and that you're trying not to be judgmental. It should be framed as about the changes rather than about them as a person, and more about that in a moment, or about all of these really in a moment. It's okay to aim for an improved version of the changes rather than perfect. I'm a firm believer that perfect doesn't really exist anyway. And so trying to think about how you could reasonably improve things is okay, rather than trying to overly kind of optimize what's there. You should always make sure that any comments that you're making are specific and that they're actionable. We've talked about that a little bit already. That you should also be making really clear what you want to be changed, and ideally providing a kind of concrete, specific suggestion using that suggested change feature. You should only choose request changes as your kind of outcome from your review if the content is wrong, in your opinion, or if it's hard to understand. Remember, this is in the context of lesson development, so lesson content that would be hard for people to understand. And in particular, it's important to keep in mind that different doesn't always mean better. And then, yeah, on the last point, if you have kind of a couple of rounds of review, there's a bit of back and forth between the reviewer and the author, and you don't really seem to be able to come to an understanding or an agreement about the best path forward, then at that point, it's probably better to take things away from that review thread, to schedule a call or something where you can discuss more in person what's going on, what needs to be changed, and things like that. Because back and forth on these threads with asynchronous text-based communication can be pretty inefficient. There's too much room for misinterpretation, I suppose, misunderstandings of what the other person means. And I do a lot of collaboration with people who are based in completely different parts of the world. And so then there's also the problem that if my colleague who's based in the Pacific US, for example, makes a comment on the pull request and then I make a comment, I almost always have to wait until the next working day before I hear back from her, because she's asleep when I'm making the comment there. Now let's talk about Alexandra Hill's recommendations. This is a blog post and a recorded talk that I strongly recommend you check out. Yeah, there's a question. I see a hand raised. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sorry, Toby. Just want to jump in on those tips. Yeah, they're all really helpful, the tips you had on the last slide. The one that really stood out for me, I just thought I'd comment, was that fourth one about making it clear what you want changed, because I think quite often, well, let's think about a scenario where you're perhaps a less experienced team member and you've suggested a few changes or you've contributed some code, and the person reviewing it might be potentially someone more experienced who maybe knows the project more deeply than you, and it's quite easy, I think, sometimes to get that kind of comment back on your work and sort of feel like, if it's not clear, then you can sort of feel like, oh, I've really messed up here, or it's just going to be a load of work to make these changes. And actually, quite often, I think the change can be quite small, or what am I trying to say? Maybe what they're suggesting you change isn't actually that massive at all, but because you don't know the project maybe as well, or you're not quite as confident, you might feel like you've got to go and do loads more work. But if they're really clear, like, this change could actually just look like this, and it could be quite simple change. Actually, that's really helpful. What I suppose what I'm trying to say is, when you know something really well, it's maybe easy to assume that everyone else knows what you're talking about.
Yeah, you made several really great points there, and that last one about how it's easy to assume that everybody else knows what you're talking about. This gets to another thing that we discuss in the Carpentries instructor training, which we refer to as expert awareness gap, but often gets called expert blind spot in the literature, which is this phenomenon where a person who is an expert in doing something has completely forgotten what it is like not to know that thing. There's a great XKCD webcomic about this as well that has a couple of chemists talking about crystal structures of things or something, which makes this point really well. I wish I had included it in the slide deck, actually. But yeah, try to build this culture, and we're fairly good at doing this, I think, in the Carpentries, of when you are giving this feedback to somebody, don't make those assumptions that they will know about a particular concept, a particular technique or something. Provide a link to a place where they can learn more. Even better, you could suggest exactly the changes that you want made yourself. And in a lot of cases, it will be quicker for you to do that than for the person who doesn't know about this yet to go and learn everything about that, to be able to do it. But sometimes the learning is the point, right? And sometimes it's a good exercise for them to go and read up about it and make the changes. If you think that that's the case here, try to link to a resource where they can get started, learn more, or, yeah, thanks very much for the XKCD link in the chat. Or even better, perhaps, link to an example of where that has been used elsewhere, either in the code base of the project or the code base of some other project that you're aware of, so that you can point the contributor towards that, and they can then go and adapt that to the particular setting of this pull request. Yeah, and so this is it's a little bit about building a culture. But yeah, that's one of the things that you can really do in your own reviews, is make sure that when you're providing feedback, that you're not making assumptions about what the contributor does and doesn't already know. If you provide a link to a thing and they already know about it, well, then no harm done, right? They're not going to follow the link and it doesn't matter. But if you don't provide the link and they don't know about it, you're potentially creating much more kind of intimidation and giving them this sense that they are somehow failing because they don't already know about this thing, which is not a nice feeling for anybody to have. So let's talk about Alexandra Hill's recommendations. There's going to be a link in a moment to the blog post or to a video, of a talk that she gave on these. That is really a better version of and possibly a shorter version of the presentation that I'm giving here today. So what? Sorry, there we go. So what she recommends, she breaks down into recommendations for teams, for organizations, for reviewers themselves, and then for authors. I'm going to not really talk about the author one so much, but for organizations, then it's about this kind of culture that you're trying to build. And so she recommends that organizations should try to encourage code pairing and this sense that the authorship, ownership of code is shared, rather than giving people a sense that they are solely responsible for the things that they put into the project. It's a good idea to discuss tasks as a group prior to their implementation. So the whole team thinks about the new feature or whatever that needs to be introduced. You can do that on the issue thread or in person or on Teams or whatever else to do that, but so that all of that discussion has happened before the implementation starts instead of afterwards. It's a good idea to avoid having a single person responsible for a whole project. Code reviews are going to improve the overall quality of the code pretty much no matter who that person is, and it gives a chance for everybody to learn and to be able to maintain that project in the long run as well. Try to emphasize a sense of teamwork at all stages. So instead of framing bugs as a particular person's fault or successes as a particular person's success, encourage this sense of shared ownership and shared responsibility for both sides of that. Celebrate successes of the team and take collective responsibility for when something has gone wrong. And make sure that everybody gets involved with code review. So everyone has their code reviewed and everyone reviews somebody else's code. You should be building a culture of where this happens often, where everybody is involved in it, so that it never feels like somebody is being singled out. You know, that other people get to have their things merged without review or committing directly to the main branch. But then there's this one person who, they need to have their changes reviewed because we don't trust them or whatever can be the sense that comes across. And now on to her recommendations for reviewers. I'm doing one per slide here because there's quite a lot of them and because I think they're really great. So the first one, try to avoid ever saying you. Try to rephrase your comments so that you use we instead of you to encourage that sense of collective ownership and responsibility. Or you can switch the wording around to make things more neutral, more passive. So instead of saying you need a unit test for this, we should unit test this, or why did you do it this way? What are the advantages of this approach? Trying to switch your language like that so that the target of the sentence that you're writing is not the person that made the changes, but instead is the changes itself or the team as a whole. Phrase things as questions as much as you can. So the example here is instead of saying we already have a function X that does this, you can say, how does this functionality differ from function X, or can we reuse X here? One of the great things about this for me as a reviewer is that I often worry that if I make a statement like this first one, it's going to turn out that I was wrong. And in fact, that function X doesn't already do exactly the same thing. And that's going to be embarrassing for everybody if I got that wrong. And so by phrasing these things as a question, it's kinder, but it also allows for the possibility that I, as the reviewer, have simply misunderstood what the person is trying to do here. But again, it makes it less about them and more about the change itself. Really, this I hope has become clear already from all of the other things that I've been talking about, but you should never ever insult somebody or use what you could consider to be insulting language about the changes that they've made. So comments like this code is a mess or this will never work, things like that are completely inappropriate. You just shouldn't use them in a code review. Try to keep in mind that the person that you're communicating with has feelings and will probably have feel some sense of kind of ownership over the changes that they are making and so on. If the changes are really so bad that it's not going to be possible with a few suggested improvements in the review to make it ready to merge, then that's probably something that you need to take away to a separate conversation rather than hashing out in the pull request thread itself, especially if the repository is visible to a lot of other people online. And you should think about how things have even got to that point where the person has made changes that you think are that far away from being ready to merge in. And I should add, especially on your public projects, you'd be surprised how much potential contributors to your projects lurk on the threads on those projects before ever making themselves kind of publicly known and opening or commenting on an issue or opening a pull request. I remember when I first started getting involved with open source projects, I watched repositories of the projects that I was interested in for weeks before I felt confident enough to open an issue on them, and then eventually open a pull request on them. And the only reason that I did eventually feel confident enough was because I had observed the kind of behavior, the way of operating that the maintainers and the other contributors on the project had. And so I felt like it was a safe space, a safe environment for me to take those kind of first steps. And sure enough, I did make a bunch of mistakes in the pull request the first pull request I ever opened. The other maintainers of other projects would have shot down in exactly this way, but the maintainers of that project were really kind and really helpful, and got things to a state that they were happy with, without making me feel terrible about myself, I suppose. This fourth one then, try to raise code quality by no more than 1 or 2 letter grades. This goes back to that blog post by Mike Lynch that I mentioned earlier as well. And Alex Hill quotes him in her blog post with, when I receive a change list that starts at a D, so thinking about this as kind of letter grades that you might get on homework or something at school, I try to help the author bring it to a C or a B minor. It's not perfect, but good enough. And this, again, is a nice way to think about that. Reframe things as, how can I make this better, rather than how can I make this perfect? Prioritize the essential, and don't worry about suggesting every little change, especially, getting a huge flood of changes back from a review can be really overwhelming and quite demoralizing and demotivating. So try to really focus on the things that are most important. And if there are other things, especially if they're things that are really a matter of personal preference for you, rather than really being something important, then leave those out altogether. And over time, you start to build up the overall quality of the code in your project. And you should be thinking about a single review as being part of this process of raising code quality, rather than the only place where that can happen. And finally, make sure that you make positive as well as constructively critical comments. And at the very least, what you can do is say thank you to somebody, but try to include some of these other phrases, things like I've got here, or the examples that I gave when I was showing GitHub earlier. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I just want to thank you for listening up to now. This is the last slide that I have, and so in a moment I'll switch back over to GitHub and we'll take a look at a couple of other pull requests there with whatever time we've got remaining. But just before I do that, then, if you want to get in touch with me in the future, you can see my email address here. I'm primarily, at least, Toby Hodges on GitHub, and only use that alter ego account for trainings and things. So don't tag that one, please. And you can find me on Blue Sky as well. If you're interested in connecting with the Carpentries, which I recommend much more than I recommend connecting with me, then there's a couple of links here that I recommend you check out. There's a link to the information page where you can learn more about that instructor training program that I mentioned before. And then this second link takes you to a page where you can learn more about the organizational memberships that the Carpentries provides, which is one of the primary ways through which individuals can access that instructor training. Just seeing that in the chat, there's been a link shared to the feedback survey. As I mentioned, please stick around because I'm not quite done yet. But as I mentioned right at the top of this session, please do take a few minutes to fill out that feedback. This is the first time that I am delivering a session on this topic. And I'm really keen to learn about the various different ways in which it could be improved. So please take a few minutes to tell me about that. And of course, if you enjoyed yourself as well, then tell me about that too. But yeah, please do take the time to fill that in. And then before I switch back over to GitHub, then what other questions do you have for me about the things that I've already talked about? And I'll use that as a moment to take another drink. Francis,
Sorry,
go ahead.
not really a question as such, but yeah, I liked your point about not trying to fix everything in when you're reviewing someone's code, because I think that is quite a temptation. Like, you can get carried away as the reviewer and go, oh, we should, change all this code style and everything. And yeah, it's definitely, as the person who's submitted that code, that's overwhelming. I just wondered whether, yeah, I suppose I was thinking, oh, you could put those further changes in your own issue, you create a new issue for that and deal with that at some future point. But I guess that might still come across as you're still trying to fix everything I've just written. I guess it's a sensitive area, really.
It is.
And the answer to all of this is like, talk to people, I guess.
I think that's exactly it. If there's anything I want you to take away from this, it's that code review shouldn't be thought of as an exclusively like functional, mechanical process. And that, if anything, I would. The short-term goal of any code review, of course, is to make sure that the changes are ready to be included in the project. But the long-term or the cumulative effect of code reviews should be to build this this culture within your project, I think. And that's going to be the effect whether you are intentional about that or not. I think that's something to keep in mind, right? That if your team is being really negative and critical and dismissive and insulting in their reviews, or if they're not really doing reviews properly at all anyway, that is building a culture in your project. It's a culture of like individuality or lack of kind of collective responsibility. And it's a culture of people being on their own and having to expect that they're going to receive a bunch of negative, really critical, not very helpful feedback if they receive any feedback at all, right? That is the culture you will build. So I much recommend that you are intentional instead about building that culture that you do want to see in your project, where people are supportive, they work together more effectively, reviews are happening often and are useful. Yeah, and everybody hopefully is having a good time. Jamie asked, would you avoid using the word but? I think yes. If there's a word that I in particular recommend that you avoid using, it's actually. But there's a lot of other, what we refer to as dismissive language in the instructor training. This really kind of demotivating language you can use. Words like obviously and basically and just, that can have the effect of giving the contributor, the person that you're talking to, the impression that they have failed somehow for not already knowing a thing. Yeah, literally to a certain extent, I think as well. I used to use obviously and basically quite a lot because I felt a sense of kind of imposter syndrome when I was explaining something to somebody and I perceived that they already knew more about the topic than I did. I would use these words like obviously and basically to try to hide the fact that I didn't feel confident about this, or that I'd only learned it recently or whatever. And that's one of the habits that I really had to try to get out of, that doing the instructor training kind of helped me focus on. And I think that these are things that apply just as much in code review as they do in teaching. Try to keep in mind this primary rule from like improv theatre and improv comedy classes, I gather. Never been to one, but I gather that the rule there is to use yes and. So when somebody has suggested some changes or something and you'd be tempted to say, this works okay, but you can say, this works well, and I think it could be improved further by blah, 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 or something like that. Whenever you're tempted to use the word but, see whether you can put the word and in instead and still make the same point overall. And avoid those other dismissive words that I mentioned earlier. Then there was another question, is there such a thing as one correct way to code? If I had to choose a yes or no answer to that question, I'd say no. I suppose it's a bit more complicated than that, right? Certainly, one of the challenges when you're reviewing, I think, is to identify how you would like it to appear is a matter of personal preference, or whether what you would suggest, how you would suggest it is done, would really be a genuine improvement. And again, that will come back to, I think, a little bit the standards that you've agreed upon, the conventions that you've agreed upon, the priorities that you've agreed upon as a team. So going back to the carpentries again as an example, a lot of the code that we write into lessons or even in our tooling is not always the most efficient, like highly optimized way of doing things, because generally speaking, we prioritize readability and understandability of the code over those other things. We know that the code examples that we put into lessons are going to be read by a human much more often than they're going to be run in a program. And therefore, how easy it is to understand, to parse as a person what that code is supposed to do and what it is doing, that's going to be much better than some one-line long monstrosity that runs 1,000 times faster than the way that we wrote it, but is really confusing and obscure to someone who's just starting out learning the language, to make it difficult for them to interpret. I think I got all of the questions now. Let's try to review one more pull request in the last 5 minutes that we have. And so I will say one more time, please fill in that feedback survey. And now I will switch over to another demonstration. So let's take a look at the two other pull requests that we have. We've got use standard error and standard out, and we've got allow multiple dice to be rolled at once. Well, the multiple dice one is like, a lot of new lines of code, 63 new lines of code. So let's skip that one and instead go for the, pull requests. Go for the standard error and standard out, because that's a little bit less. Yeah, it's +5 lines, -2 lines. So it's a little bit smaller. Here what the person is doing is they're adjusting how the logging information is done. So it used to be printed to the screen, rolling this, and instead now they're using this sys.stderr object in Python, which is telling the print function to send the changes to the standard error stream. What I prefer to do instead of this is, instead of using the print function, I like to use the sys.standarderror.write function. It then writes whatever string we provide to it to that standard error stream instead. I think it's nicer, and there are some things that people can do to effectively switch off these print statements so that they don't work anymore. And if someone ran our program in that mode, they would stop receiving output altogether. And so what I want to do here then is recommend a different way of doing things. So we can open a comment on this particular line. We can say, this is exactly where I wanted the logging information to be sent to avoid, so I stopped myself from using the word but there, to avoid situation where somebody accidentally turned off output altogether, we should use sys.stder.write and sys.stdout.write instead of print. All right, I might, instead of saying we should, I might say, I think it would be better to use instead of print. What do you think? And then comment directly to invite feedback from them. I'm sort of implying here that I'm not sure. I kind of am sure, but I think it's better to invite them into a conversation where I feel fairly confident I'm going to be able to bring them around to my way of thinking. But they might also have reasons why they chose to use print here, and this would give them an opportunity to suggest that. You could rephrase this as a question to say, should we use this and this to avoid the situation where that's a question as well. So I'd then start a review. I've got less than a minute left, so I'm going to stop, I think, here in a moment. And I would then suggest an equivalent change to use the sys.stdout.write function here instead of print as well. And then I'd submit the review requesting changes and wait for them to come back and engage in that discussion with me. And I will stop sharing my screen because we're pretty much out of time. Thank you very much for listening, for your engagement in the chat and with live questions as well. I hope this was helpful to you. If you ever want to hear more about this topic or you want to spend more time practicing with this, then let me know. I'd be happy to come back sometime in the future. And yeah, good luck with your code reviews and your projects in the future. Thanks again.